Peart, the assistant overseer, read, loud enough for the whole vestry. Arrears of 3 years on the Sallow Piece. The late Mrs. Peart, defaulter. Susanna stood up at the back, so they would have to look at her. Her mother had been dead 5 weeks. The strip was 10 acres of sedge, and whin behind Maybe's plantation, with no lane to it, rated as though it grew wheat. I'll pay the arrears, she said. I want to see the rate book and the award. Maybe was chairman of the vestry, overseer of the poor, and a magistrate. He said the books were in good order, and the meeting had business. She had copied rate books 11 years at 9pence, the folio for a Norwich attorney, until his son came into the office. She knew what an honest book looked like. The award described 10 acres and 2 roods. On Saturday, she walked it with her father's chain and made it 8 acres and 2 roods. On Monday, she asked the churchwarden for the perambulation book, the one the parish carried when it beat the bounds. He brought it out slowly and let her turn the leaves herself. 3 pages had been cut from it at the year 1813. Samuel Lodes took the book out of her hands before she reached the next entry. That's parish property, he said. So are the bounds. She kept her voice level, the way she had learned to in an office full of men. Who cut them? Lodes carried the book to the chest, laid it under the register, and turned the key twice. His hands were not steady. He had been churchwarden 9 years, and he did not look at her while he did it. Before my time, he said. On Wednesday, Maybe came to her mother's cottage himself, which was more courtesy than he had ever shown Rachel Peart living. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand and did not sit. You'll be going to your cousin in Norwich, he said. I've not decided. The cottage falls in at Lady Day. You know that. He looked around the room, at the bed, the chair, the deal box under the window. I'll take the Sallow Piece off you, £30. And I'll settle the arrears with the overseers myself. £30 was more than she had earned in 2 years of copying. It would keep her a 12-month in a lodging in Norwich while she looked for a desk that would have a woman at it. Why does a man pay £30 for sour ground? It squares my wood. It squared your wood before you offered. Maybe smiled at that. He had a broad, orderly face, and he was proud of being reasonable in public. There's not 8 acres of standing ground in the whole of it, he said. The rest is water in a wet year. You'd do well to take my money before you learn that yourself. She said she would think on it. He put his hat on and told her to send word by Sunday. She did not send word. There were 3 roads out of Sedge Row that March. Her cousin in Norwich would take her as an upper servant and remind her of it at dinner every day for the rest of her life. The house at Downham took women who had nothing, and it took their names off them at the door. The 3rd road was a mile north over the drove. At the end of it stood 10 acres of sedge and a ruined brick cottage by a silted drain. Neither of them belonged to anybody but her. On the day after Lady Day, she gave the keys to Job Thirkettle at the vestry steps. He counted them into his palm and looked unhappy about it. There's a bed at my sister's for a week, he said. If you're stuck, I'm not stuck. I'm going to my own, Susanna. He lowered his voice. That ground drowns. Then I'll want boots. She loaded the barrow with what the sale of her mother's furniture had not taken. A bolster, a kettle, 2 blankets, a rush basket of tools, her father's gunter chain in its leather case, and her mother's deal box. The wheel bogged twice on the drove. A man mowing thistles watched her the whole length of the headland and did not offer a hand. The load house had no door. Elder had come up through the floor of the east room where the roof had fallen in, and a moorhen's nest sat cold in the hearth. The west room still had rafters and half its thatch. Somebody had used the sill of the west window as a chopping block for kindling. The light was going. Water moved in the lode behind the house, slow and full, which meant the drain still ran even if nothing else did. She set her mother's box down on the brick floor. It stood level. She slept the first night in the west room, with the barrow pulled across the doorway and a rushlight burning in a saucer of grease. Rain came in before midnight. It found the gap where the thatch had slipped off the ridge and ran down the inside of the wall in 3 separate lines. She moved the bolster twice and then gave up and sat against the box with a blanket round her shoulders, listening to the load. By first light, she knew 4 things about the house. The brick was sound to the string course, and the clunch above it was crumbling. The west room could be roofed by 1 man in 3 days if the man had read. The chimney drew, and the sill of the door had been cut for a door 2 inches wider than any door she could afford. She walked into the village at 7 for milk, and got none. Marion Fish kept the beer house and a cow and a long memory. She stood in her doorway with her arms folded over her apron and looked at the empty can. "Ready money," she said. "I'll have money Friday." "Your mother had money Friday for 9 years." Susanna stood still. It was the first time anyone had said it to her face rather than into a book. "My mother paid her rate," she said. "I'll prove it before Michaelmas. Then come Michaelmas and I'll sell you milk." A boy on the bridge shouted Peart's folly after her, and 2 women at the pump stopped talking until she was past. She carried the empty can home along the load bank, 1.5 miles round, because the drove went over Maybe's headland, and she had begun to think about what that meant. That week, she measured properly. She cut 40 pegs from the alder car and sharpened them, and made a set of 10 arrows out of wire from the old sluice frame. She chained from the corner of the churchyard wall down the parish road, because she wanted a datum that 100 people could see. Then she chained the Sallow Piece in 3 lines, north, east, and diagonal, and offset the crooked places. That evening she plotted it on the back of a rate schedule, 3 chains to the inch, 8 acres, 2 roods, 14 perches. The award said 10 acres and 2 roods. She checked her own arithmetic twice, then chained the north line again on the Thursday in case the wet had shrunk her tape hand. 8 acres, 2 roods, 15 perches. Ground does not lose an acre and 3 roods by accident, and paper does not gain it. The north line was where the trouble sat. It ran along the plantation, and the plantation had a bank and a ditch. Her father had taught her that in a lane when she was 9. A man who digs a ditch on his own land throws the soil onto his own side, so the bank tells you whose ditch it is. Here the bank stood inside the wood, and the ditch lay outside it, on her ground, which meant the wood had come out to meet her, and not the other way about. The oaks behind the bank were 30 years old at most. She counted the rings on a stump where a tree had been thrown by a gale and made it 32. The fence itself was newer still, chestnut posts with the adze marks fresh under the moss. On the Friday she took the drove to save the round, with the barrow and 8 bundles of cut reed, and Albie Pike came across the headland to meet her before she was halfway. He was Maybe's foreman, a square man in a wet coat, and he was not unfriendly about it. "There's no road that way," he said. "There was a drove. My father walked a wagon down it. Mr. Maybe's drove, for Mr. Maybe's carts." "Then how does a body get to the Sallow Piece?" Pike looked over her head at the fen and at the load bank going round in its long, useless curve, and she watched him decide not to answer. "Was there ever a lane down to the North Fen?" she asked. "My father spoke of one, wide enough for a wagon." "There was never a lane," Albie Pike said. "Ask anybody." She went round by the bank. It took her 50 minutes with the barrow. She came home with her skirt to the knee in black water, and she wrote the time down in her book with the date against it. Ezra Bunn came up the load bank on the 2nd Monday in April, a ladder on his shoulder and a hay fork under his arm. He stopped at the gap where the door should have been. "You'll want the reed laid before the wind turns," he said. "I've no money for a thatcher." "I never said thatcher." He set the ladder against the west gable. "I said I've a ladder." Ezra had 11 acres, 4 fields, 2 cows, and a rate demand he did not believe in. He said so while they worked. It took them 3 days to strip the old thatch and lay new reed over the west room. Susanna learned that a fen man will talk himself hoarse about drainage. He goes quiet the moment the word maybe is said out loud. She paid him the only way she could. She chained his 4 fields, plotted them, and wrote out a valuation in a clerk's hand on good paper. The 2 low fields flooded 10 weeks in 4 years out of 5. The rate had been struck on them as sound pasture since 1839. Ezra took the paper to the vestry in a clean coat. Thurkettle read it twice and carried it to the next vestry. And the new rate was struck, £2.08 lower. The village heard about that before the week was out. A woman came up the bank on the Saturday and asked her to write a letter to a son in Canada and paid 2 pence. A carter's widow wanted a copy of her husband's paper of apprenticeship. By the end of April, she had a shelf, a stool, a door bought second-hand for 4 shillings, and 1 and 9 pence in a tin. 4 people who had not spoken to her in March now spoke to her in the street. She had also begun to be watched. On the last day of the month, the Reverend Aubrey Winch sent word that he wanted the glebe terrier copied fair, and would pay 12 shillings for it. The rectory smelled of coal and old carpet. Mr. Winch was 41, gouty, cautious, and honest in the way that gives a man no trouble until the day it does. He put the old terrier of 1,804 inches front of her, with the draft of the new one. She was to make the new agree with the old, wherever the old was still true. She worked at his table for 2 afternoons. On the 2nd afternoon, she stopped in the middle of a line and put her pen down. "Sir, this entry, which the glebe close called Barrow Pytle. In the old terrier it abuts north upon the poor's allotment." She turned the book. "In the draft it abuts north upon Mr. Maybe's plantation." Winch looked at it over his spectacles. "Well, it does abut on the plantation. I have walked it." "Then where is the poor's allotment?" "The Sallow Piece," he said, with the patience of a man explaining the obvious. "Which you have. Which is why the parish has been so lenient about your rate, whatever you may think of us. The Sallow Piece lies west of Barrow Pytle." She drew it for him with the flat of her hand on the table. "Not north. It has never lain north of anything but the load. If my strip is the poor's allotment, then the old terrier is wrong, and it has been wrong since before I was born. And if the old terrier is right, then in 1804 there was a piece of ground north of Barrow Pytle that the parish called the poor's allotment, and it was not mine." The rector's hand went still on the arm of his chair. "That is a great deal to hang on one word. It's a boundary word. They are the only words that matter in a terrier." She kept her voice flat and let the paper do the work. "May I see the churchwarden's accounts, Miss Peart?" He took his spectacles off. "You have been back in this parish 3 months, and you have already made an enemy who dines with the bishop's chaplain. I've made no enemy. I've read a book." Winch was quiet for a while. Outside, somebody was dragging a hurdle across the yard, and the noise went on for longer than it. "The accounts are in the chest," he said at last. "The chest wants 2 keys, and Loads has one of them, and I have the other. And I am not going to be the man who asks him for his." "Then don't ask him. Ask for both books on a Tuesday, when he cleans the vestry." He laughed, unwillingly, and told her to finish the terrier. She got the accounts on the 3rd Tuesday in May, with Loads standing over her the whole time, and Winch pretending to sort hymn books at the far end of the vestry. The book was foolscap, bound in vellum gone the color of an old tooth, and it ran from 1791 to 1834 in 5 different hands. She turned to 1,813 and read with her hands behind her back, because a woman who touches a page is accused of altering it. Michaelmas 1,813. Paid Reuben Scoyles, stonecutter of Stowwythe, for 22 mere stones with numbers cut, and for setting the same. £11. She read the line 4 times. Below it, paid Elias Peart, chainman, 14 days at 2 shillings. £1 8 shillings. Her father's name in another man's handwriting, 36 years old. He had been 19 that summer. He had told her about it perhaps twice, at the end of long days. She had been too young to ask the right questions. Then he died in the winter of 1841, with a cough that started in the fen. That night, she untied the field books at the bottom of her mother's box, 11 of them in canvas covers, and opened the earliest at the first page, and could not go on with it. She had not been able to read his hand since the funeral. She tied the tape again. She turned on. Lady Day 1815. Received of the rent of the allotment for the poor, £58 4 and paid out for fuel, coals and turf, delivered to 51 families, £55 9. The same entry in 1816, in a different hand. In 1817 a shorter one. Received of the rent of the allotment, £29 2, being the half year. After that, nothing. Not a shilling of rent, not a hundredweight of coal, and no line saying why. The next page began the church rate for 1,818, as if the poor of Sedge Row had stopped needing to be warm. "You've been an hour," Lode said. "I'll be an hour more. I've a pump to see to." "Then leave the key with Mr. Winch." He did not leave the key. He stood by the door and worked his jaw, and let her feel him standing there. She copied what she needed into her own book in a small, fast hand, and thanked him at the end as though he had done her a courtesy. June was the sedge cutting. She cut in the shallow water at the top of the lode, standing to the knee in it from 6 in the morning. She tied and stooked, and carted the bundles round the long way on the barrow. Sedge sold at 4p the bundle to a thatcher at Stowithe. He beat her down to 3p 3 farthings, because he could. 208 bundles came to £3, 5 shillings. She paid the arrears on the Sallow Piece in 2 installments, £1 7 and 3p each, and made Thirkettle write her a receipt both times and sign it. "You needn't have that from me every time," he said the second time. "My mother thought so too." He looked at the desk. "I was 19 when your mother was put in that book. I copied what I was told to copy. I know it. That's why I want the receipt." She got a cough out of the sedge, cutting that stayed with her into June, and made her sit down on the stairs sometimes to get her breath. She burned turf, she cut herself and ate bacon and fen greens, and bread when she could get flour. Every fact she had went into one column of her book, the way an office does it. In June she wrote to the clerk of the peace at Norwich, and asked what a copy of the award would cost. The answer came in a clerk's hand. "A search must be made in person, by an interested party. 1 shilling. An office copy of the material part, certified, 7 shillings and 6p. She had 2 and 4p in the tin that week, and a hole over the east room. Then she counted the plan. The parish copy of the award plan hung framed in the vestry under glass, foxed and yellow. The allotments were numbered, and the boundary stones were drawn as small black squares along the north and east lines. She stood in front of it on the last Thursday in June, with her hat in her hand like a woman admiring a picture, and she counted the little black squares twice. 15. The church wardens had paid Reuben Scoils for 22 stones and for setting them, and the parish's own plan showed 15. 7 stones had been paid for out of the parish books, cut with numbers on them, carted, and set in the ground in the autumn of 1813. Then they had gone somewhere that no map in Sedge Row would admit to. The school path crossed the lode 100 yards below her house, and it crossed on a single slab of stone. She had walked over it perhaps 40 times by July. Children went over it twice a day in a stream, and the miller's boy took a barrow over it. And the slab had a worn hollow in the middle, where 2 generations of feet had polished it gray. What made her stop was rain. The water lay in that hollow after a shower, and dried from the edges inward. One hot afternoon she came up from the sedge beds, and saw the wet shape shrinking in the middle of the slab. The dry margin round it ran straight, and it ended in a worked edge. Somebody had cut that edge with a chisel, and had run a chamfer along it. And no man chamfers a stone he means to throw in a ditch. She got down on her knees on the path, and put her fingers under the north lip. It was 6 inches thick and bedded in silt, and she could not shift it alone. She went for Ezra Bunn and his crowbar, and Ezra brought his brother-in-law. By the time the three of them had levered the slab up onto its edge, there were 9 people on the bank. Nothing travels through a fen village faster than the news that somebody is digging. The underside was clean. Silt had kept the air off it for years. Cut into the face, deep, in Roman numerals 2 inches high, was Levantine. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then a woman said, "Well, that's a gatepost." A man said it was a coping stone off the old chapel. Ezra Bunn said nothing at all and looked north across the sedge to the black line of the plantation. Susanna went for her chain. She set her arrows from the slab in a straight line to the plantation fence. Ezra carried the forend, and a boy dragged the chain out of the rushes when it caught. The village came along behind in 1s and 2s, as though it were a wedding. 6 chains and 54 links. 144 yards. That is 144 yards of Mr. Maybe's wood between where that stone lay and where his fence stands, she said, loud enough for the back of the crowd. Where it stood at first I can't tell you yet. Loads had come down. He had his coat on over his shirt sleeves. "That stone is not on the plan," he said. "No, sir, it isn't." "Then it proves nothing. It proves the parish paid for it." She wiped her hands on her apron. Stone 17. The plan in the vestry has 15 stones and stops at 15. Either Reuben Scoils cut 7 stones that nobody ordered, or the plan in the vestry is not the award. That was the sentence she had been afraid of for 3 weeks, and hearing herself say it in the open air was worse than she had expected. Half the people on the bank stepped back from it. Calling a man a thief is one thing. Calling the parish's own hanging plan a lie is another. And it takes in every churchwarden, every overseer, and every dead man who ever signed a rate. "You want to be careful," Lode said. Behind him, at the edge of the group, an old man had been standing for some time without speaking. Noah Crick was 74 years old and had lived in the parish all his life. He lived in the end house of Maybe's Row with his daughter, her husband, and his granddaughter Ellen. He had a bad hip and a good memory. He came forward now and looked at the numeral for a long while. There was 2 and 20, he said. The bank went quiet. "I carried the pegs for the stone setter," Crick said. "I was 8 and 30 and glad of the work." 2 and 20, miss." They went from the bridge, round the north fen, and back to the head of the lode. "This here is the 17th of them, and it never stood in this path in its life." Lodes told him he was an old man and misremembered. Crick did not argue. He looked at the slab, and then at the plantation, and then, briefly, at the roof of the house he lived in, which belonged to Maybe. "I misremember," he agreed, and went home. Mabe came himself on the 2nd Saturday in August, driving his own gig round by the load bank because the drove was too soft after the storm. Susanna was on the roof. She had the east room stripped to the rafters at last and was laying the last of Ezra Bunn's reed on the lower course. She stayed where she was for a moment, mallet in hand, and looked down at him. The roof was the only high ground she had. "Come down, Miss Peart." "I'm not going to shout." She came down. He had a folded paper in his breast pocket, and he did not take it out at first. He walked the length of the house instead. He looked at the new reed, the mended sill, the bean rows she had put in on the dry corner. He was fair about it, in a way that frightened her more than temper would have. "You've done more here in 5 months than that place has had in 40 years, he said. "I'll say that anywhere. Thank you. Now let me say the rest." He took out the paper. £40. "Your arrears wiped, and I'll pay the rate on the strip for the term of your life. And the 2 acres you say are short, I'll convey to you by deed, out of the plantation, fenced at my charge, with a right-of-way down the drove for a cart. That is more than any court in England would give you, and you know it. You have read more law in an office than most men in this parish will read in their lives. It was more than a court would give her. That was the trouble with it. £40 was a roof over both rooms, a stove, a cow, and 2 years of not being afraid in November. The 2 acres would make her measure true and put her chain and her name on the same side of the argument. Every count she had made would be answered. And she would be, in the eyes of Sedge Row, a woman who had been right. And the paper? She said. A release. Of all claims, of every kind, in the parish of Sedge Row, by you or by any person on your behalf. He held it out. It is the usual form. It is the usual form, she agreed. I have copied out 40 of them. She did not take it, Mr. Maybe. In 1815, the church wardens received £62 of rent from an allotment for the poor of this parish, and laid out 59 of it on coals for 51 families. In 1818 they received nothing and laid out nothing, and no one has laid out anything since. There are people in that row of yours who have burned green wood every winter of their lives. You are talking about a book. I am talking about 32 winters. She put her hands behind her back. If I sign that, the 2 acres are mine and the whole of that fen is yours forever. And I am paid for keeping quiet with a piece of the thing I was robbed of. I won't. Mabe folded the paper along its old crease and put it back in his pocket, unhurried. You had a mother who would not be told either, he said. She died in a rented room. She died with a receipt in her box that this parish never asked to see. He got up into the gig and turned it on the bank. And the wheel went within a foot of her bean rows and did not touch them, which was somehow worse. The notice was served on Noah Crick's son-in-law 9 days later. A week. To quit the end house of the row. No reason given. None needed. Crick's winter coal allowance, which came out of Maybe's own pocket as a charity and had come every year since his wife died, stopped in the same week. They came up the bank at dusk on a Thursday. The old man and the girl. With a barrow. They can bide with her husband's people, Crick said. There's no room for me. And Ellen both. Susanna looked at the east room, which had a roof now and no floor and no chimney. There's room, she said. That autumn she spent £1 9 shillings, which was everything in the tin, on flour and bacon and a load of turf and a second bedstead. The rector sent word by the boy that he would not be needing further copying at present. Noah Crick sat by her fire on the first cold night and told her where the stones had gone. Hay month. 17. 4 of us, and 2 horses. They went in the bottom of the new bank, laid flat, and the earth over them. He held his hands to the blaze. I'll swear to it before any man living, if I've a roof to come back to. The notice about the drove was nailed to the gatepost on the 4th of October, printed, with Maybe's attorney's name at the foot, warning all persons against trespass. After that everything she owned went round by the load bank, 1.5 miles each way, and October was wet. The summons came on the 29th. 1 year's rate on the Sallow Piece, 18 shillings and 2 pence, with costs, returnable at the petty sessions at Stowith. She had 4 shillings and 7 pence in the tin, and 2 mouths beside her own. And the reed would not be fit to cut before Christmas. She wrote to Bartle Sturman in Norwich, her old master, and asked him what a distress warrant could take from a person who held land in her own right. He answered in a week, on his own paper, in his own hand, which surprised her. It could take anything. Not on her back or in her hands at that moment. The tools of her trade were privileged only while there was other sufficient distress in the house. And there was. He was sorry. He hoped she was well. He remained her obedient servant. They came on the 12th of November. 2 men and a cart. Thurkettle walked behind them, because the law required an overseer to be present, and he had not been able to get out of it. She stood in the doorway with Ellen behind her and let them in, because a woman who bars a door gets written up as violent. They took the kettle and the second bedstead, the stool, a spade, a hurdle of new reed. They took her father's chain in its leather case. They took the boxwood scale rule and the brass dividers she had bought with her first quarter's wages in Norwich when she was 22, and they took her mother's deal box with the papers in it, because it was furniture, and it stood on the floor. "That's papers," she said. "Nothing in it worth a shilling. It's a box," the elder man said, not unkindly. "Box is a box." Thirkettle wrote the inventory on the wall of the house with the paper flat against the brick. Goods to the value of £4. Sale at the Ram at Stowhythe on the 4th of December. Or redemption before, on payment of the rate and costs, and the expenses of the distress. He would not look at her until he had finished writing. Then he did. "I'll bid for the chain," he said low. "Bid for the box." The flood came 8 days later. A northeaster blew for 2 days and backed the water up the main drain. The load had no sluice door. It had rotted off its hangings before she was born, and the sluice belonged to a trust that no longer met. On the 20th, the water came over the low bank at the head of the load at about 4 in the morning, quietly. By 7 it stood 10 inches deep across 5 acres of the Sallow Piece. It took the bean rows and the winter greens and the seed she had saved. It took the turf stack she had cut and dried all summer and carried the top of it out into the fen in a long trail. She stood on the bank in the gray light and watched a winter's fuel and the money for next year's rate go away from her at walking pace. There was not one thing in the world she could do about it. The house stood. The brick took the water to the string course, and the west room stayed dry by 3 inches. Ellen came out with the lamp when it was light enough to see the damage properly. Noah Crick stood in the doorway on his bad hip and said nothing. The 3 of them looked at it for a while. On the Friday, Susanna walked into the village through the wet and found Winch in the vestry. "The plan," she said. "It's gone from the wall. It has been sent to Norwich to be backed with linen," the rector said. "It was in poor condition. The chairman gave the order, and the vestry approved it. I approved it, Miss Peart. It was proposed as a repair, and I could hardly speak against a repair." She stood in the empty square on the whitewash where the frame had hung for as long as she had been alive. Everything she had was in a cart bound for a sale room or under 10 inches of fen water. The rest was in a crate on its way to a man in Norwich who would be paid to handle it. Then she thought of her father, 19 years old, walking 14 days behind a stone setter at 2 shillings a day. He had written everything down, all his life, in little canvas-covered books, and she had never opened the one for 1,813. It had gone out of her door at 11 that morning in her mother's box. The sale at the Ram at Stowhythe began at 11, and her lot came up at 20 past. She had written letters for 8 days to raise the money, at 2p and 3p, and had sat up 2 nights over a copy of a marriage settlement that Sturman sent from Norwich by the carrier. His note said only, "This is work, not charity. Do it well." The settlement paid 15 shillings, and the letters 8 and 4p. £1 3 and 4p in the tin, and every farthing of it spoken for. The room was full. Half of Sedge Row had walked the 4 miles to Stowhythe to see what a distress on a woman looked like. The chain went first. Thirkettle bid 5 shillings, and a dealer from Lynn went to 8. Then Ezra Bunn, who had told her he was not coming, said 9 from the back wall. In the voice of a man confessing to something, he handed it to her outside afterwards without a word and went to look at a horse. The box came up as lot 9, with a broken fire iron and a hurdle in one lot. "Deal box, papers, sundries," the auctioneer said. "Who'll say 2 shillings? 2, said Susanna. There was a movement at the side of the room. Marion Fish had refused her milk in April and had not spoken to her since. She stood with her arms folded and looked round the room the way a woman looks round her own tap room at closing time. 3, said a man near the door. 4, said Marion Fish, and then, to the room in general, "And I'll remember the next one to bid." Nobody bid. Marion gave the box to Susanna on the step with the ticket still on it. She said her mother had once sat up with her, through a bad lying in, and went off to buy salt without waiting to be thanked. The field books were where she had left them in May. At the bottom, under the receipts, tied in 2 bundles with tape, she found what she wanted at 9:30 that night, with Ellen asleep and the fire down to turf ash. The book for 1,813 was ruled in her father's young hand. The figures cramped, the offsets drawn small and exact. Chain lines round the North Fen. 22 stations. Against each station a numeral. Against numeral 17, the note. In the load bank at the schoolway. Against 18, 19 and 20. In the fen, on the line. The distances were written out in chains and links. On the last used page, in the same hand but heavier, a memorandum dated the 3rd of November, 1817. This second plan I did not sign. The line is not where we set it. E. Peart. And underneath, in a hand she knew better than her own, because it had taught her to write, paid rate, 1,844. Receipt herewith. They will not enter it. R.P. The book for 1,841 had a folded sheet in the back cover. It was the draft of a letter to the Vestry, asking on what authority the poor's allotment had been let to a trustee, with the day he sent it written under the signature. Susanna sat with the 2 books open on her knees for a long time. She went to Norwich on the 12th of February, by the carrier to Downham, and the train from there. 4 and 2pence and the same to come back. She lay the night at a lodging in Street, Augustine's for 8pence, and was at the castle when the office opened. Every enclosure award in England is made in duplicate. 1 copy stays in the parish, where a churchwarden may keep it under glass or send it away to be repaired. The other is deposited with the clerk of the peace for the county, and sits on a shelf, and no man in Sedge Row has any power over it whatever. The search cost a shilling. The clerk brought the roll out on his shoulder and unrolled it on the long table and put weights on the corners. Allotment number 4. 62 acres, 1 rood, 8 perches, bounded north by the Great Fen, drove and east by the Old Lode. Set out to the churchwardens and overseers of the parish of Sedge Row and their successors, in trust, the rents and profits thereof to be laid out yearly in fuel for the poor of the said parish, and not otherwise. 22 stones on the plan, numbered I to 22, small black squares in a long chain round the North Fen, and a drove, marked in double lines, running from the parish road to the head of the lode. She paid 7 and 6pence for an office copy of the schedule and the material part of the plan, certified and sealed. She carried it out into the market in an oilskin under her coat. Then she stood among the stalls with 4pence left and did the arithmetic. 62 acres. 33 winters of green wood. Ascension Day fell on the 9th of May, and Sedge Row beat its bounds for the first time since 1836. When the line had been walked as pointed out by Maby's father. It was the rector who called it, which was the only way it could have been called at all. Winch had read the office copy twice and gone white. Then he did the thing Susanna had not expected of him. He wrote to the clerk of the peace himself, and to the diocesan registrar, and asked whether a trust of that kind could lapse because nobody had troubled to collect the rent. The answer came back in a fortnight, and was 2 lines long. 9 parishioners subscribed 3 guineas between them for Mr. Alfred Grigson, land surveyor, of Norwich, who arrived on the 8th with 2 chainmen, a theodolite he did not need, and a manor that would have annoyed anybody who was not depending on it. They started at 7 in the morning at Stone One, which had never moved, at the corner of the bridge. There were about 140 people on the bank at the start and more than 200 by 10 o'clock. Children were sent up the line with willow wands, the way children always are. Grigson chained from the plan. Station by station, Susanna read the distances from her father's field book aloud, so that 2 measures were called out in front of the parish at every peg. Ellen Crick carried the arrows and did not drop one. Stone 13 came out of a ditch bottom at the bend of the lode, whole, with the numeral clean. Stone 17 was already lying on the bank where they had left it in July. At Station 18, the chain ran them 138 yards inside the plantation, in among the 33-year-old oaks. Grigson set his peg on the leaf mold. 2 feet, I should think, he said. 2 men with spades began to dig, and the parish stood round in a ring, and nobody spoke at all. It came up at 20 inches, laid flat, face down, on a bed of clay. Xvi. Somebody at the back cheered and was hushed. Noah Crick, who had walked the whole line on his bad hip with his hand on his granddaughter's shoulder, sat down suddenly on a fallen bough and put his hat over his face. 19 was under the bank itself, where he had said it would be. 20 was in the mouth of a field drain, doing duty as a sill. 21 came up at 4 o'clock, under a heap of stubbed thorn. Maybe came at noon, on foot, with Albie Pike and his attorney behind him, and the crowd opened for him and closed again. "This is a riot," he said. "It is a perambulation, Mr. Maybe," Winch said. "The parish has beaten its bounds in Rogation Week since before either of us was born." "On my land, on the poor's allotment," Susanna said. She had the office copy out of the oilskin. She read the words of the trust to him, standing on his own leaf mold with 200 people listening. When she had finished, she said the rest of it plainly. She had waited 14 months to say it in front of witnesses. 62 acres, held by the overseers in trust, and let by you to yourself. Your father took the stones up in Hay month of 17, with 4 men, and one of them is sitting on that bough. You took the ground from him at Michaelmas 1,820, and you have let it to yourself ever since. 3 leaves were cut out of the perambulation book in 1841. When my father wrote to the Vestry, "There is no such letter," Lodes said too quickly, from the edge of the crowd. "There is a copy of it in his field book, Mr. Lodes. He was a chain man. He copied everything." She turned back to Maybe. "It is all arithmetic. It has been arithmetic the whole time." Maybe did the thing his whole life had trained him to do. He sent Pike back to the house for his books. He put them on the tailboard of a cart in front of the parish, to prove that his affairs were regular. They were regular, magnificently regular, ruled and totaled and carried forward in his own hand for 29 years. Rent of the North Fen ground, 21 acres, 2 roods, at 8 shillings the acre. Received of D. Maybe. Paid to D. Maybe, trustee. Grigson read it out. He had a carrying voice, and he enjoyed using it. The vestry met that evening in the schoolroom and resolved to petition the Master of the Rolls under Sir Samuel Romilly's Act for an account of the charity. Winch signed it first, and Ezra Bunn signed it 9th. Maybe walked home through his own wood alone, past the open hole where Stone 18 had been. The settlement was signed in September, and it was not a triumph. It was 4 months of letters, 2 councils' opinions, and a great deal of arithmetic done twice. Maybe's own solicitor advised him that the trust was good, the deposit copy conclusive, and the stones fatal. What remained was the figure. Sturman opened at 2,100, being rent at a proper letting value for the 29 years Maybe had held the ground. His man came back at 400. They settled at £840, payable in 3 yearly installments, with the whole allotment given up at Michaelmas, plantation and all, and his tenancy of it determined. He resigned as trustee and as guardian of the poor. His name was struck off the list for the commission of the peace in the spring, quietly, in the way such things are done. He kept his farm, 400 acres of it, and his pew, and he still owns them. Susanna had wanted more than that for about a week, and then found she did not. The parish took possession of 62 acres of the North Fen at Michaelmas 1,850, and she staked it out herself in October, with Ellen Crick on the fore end of the chain. 36 acres went into 72 gardens of a half acre, let at 12 shillings a year. Any man or woman in the parish who held no land might take one, and the widows stood first on the list. 18 acres were let, as one holding at 24 shillings the acre. 8 acres of turf fen were kept in hand for fuel. Noah Crick was made its keeper at £4 a year and a load of turf, which meant a roof of his own and a reason to walk out to it. The rent came to £64 16 shillings in the first year. By a separate term of the settlement, Maybe paid £28 for a new sluice door and hangings at the head of the load, because the trust money could go on fuel and nothing else. The drove was declared a public way to the fen by agreement, which cost him nothing and saved him a suit. Coal was delivered at half price to 58 families in the winter of 1851. The entry went into the churchwarden's book in the old form, because Susanna had copied the wording out of 1815 and would not have it altered. In the rate book, at the foot of the page for 1844, Job Thurkettle wrote a memorandum in front of the vestry. The sum charged as arrear against Rachel Peart, widow, had been paid on the 2nd of April in that year. Receipt produced and examined. The word entered against her name was struck out in error, and stood struck out now. It took 4 minutes. Susanna had thought she would cry and did not. She read it, checked the date, and asked him to initial it. She was appointed measurer and clerk to the trustees of the fuel allotment at £14 a year. 3 other parishes had her out that summer. To reset bounds gone doubtful, at a guinea a day. And her carriage. A solicitor in Lynn began sending her plans to copy, because Sturman had told him she was the best hand he ever had at 3 chains to the inch. Marion Fish sold her milk from the Michaelmas and never once mentioned March. Lodes gave up the wardenship and moved to his daughters at Wisbeck. The rector preaches on the subject about once a year, badly, and means it. Ellen Crick carries the chain and is learning the offsets, and will be better at it than her mistress, and says so. The load house has a floor in both rooms now, a stove, a mended sill, and a door that fits. The trustees meet at her table 4 times a year because it is the only table in the parish nobody argues about. On the 2nd of June, 1851, stone 22 came back to the head of the load. It had been found in a farm wall at Stowhythe. The stone cutter there was Reuben Scoyles' grandson, and he cut the numeral deeper for nothing and would not take a shilling for the cart. They set it in a bed of clay in the evening, Ezra Bunn and Thurkettle on the levers, Crick giving directions nobody needed, and Ellen holding the arrows. Susanna trued it with a plumb bob and a straight edge, and had them shift it twice, which the men complained about at some length. Beyond it the gardens ran away north in strips, beans in flower on the near ground, potatoes on the far, and somebody's boy shouting at somebody's goat. She wrote the bearing and the distance in the book, and closed it, and went in to get the supper.